If you've been playing around with Linux at all recently, you probably know that installing that operating system is not the hardest part. No, the hardest part is figuring out which Linux distribution is going to be right for you. With over 600 distributions available, that task can be almost mind-bogglingly daunting. So today on Tech Talk, we're going to go through a process that hopefully will help you to find the right distribution for you. That's coming up right now, right here on Tech Talk. So picking out the right Linux distribution, the right version of Linux that's good for you can feel like a really daunting task when there's so many options available. But there are a few things that we can look at that helps to narrow the field down so you can pick out maybe 3, 4, or 5 and then test them out to see if they're a good fit for you. So today we're going to go through exactly how we kind of narrow things down, make it a little bit easier, and help you make a decision that's really going to be good for the type of computing that you like to do. So the first thing to really understand about Linux is there's 3 major varieties of Linux. There's 3 underlying foundations that Linux is built on. It's either Arch, Fedora, or Debian. Those are the 3 big ones. And generally speaking, they have different features about them that make them right or wrong for different types of people. So let's go over them one by one. So Linux distributions that are based on Arch have a couple of features. Arch is very frequently updated. It's being updated all the time to keep it right on the cutting edge, to make it compatible with very modern hardware, which is great. But when you've got those frequent updates, what does happen is it tends to be less focused on stability. So if a really stable computer that doesn't cause you any problems is your #1 priority, Arch might not be the right choice for you. Arch can be, a lot of distributions can be more difficult to install and use than other versions, and the app availability isn't as widespread as other types of Linux. And it does focus a little bit more on proprietary software that's made by companies that expect you to pay for it versus open source software that's either free or done on a donation basis. Now there are several versions of Arch Linux. There's Manjaro Linux, there's Kashi OS and Steam OS. Those are all based on Arch. They're all great distributions. Now the second type of Linux that you'll see in distributions is based on Fedora. Now Fedora is actually pretty similar to Arch. It also wants to be kind of on the cutting edge, very up to date. You get very frequent updates on the operating system generally. It is backed by Red Hat, which is a very long-standing, well-known organization that works on Linux. And again, Fedora also sort of prioritizes being very cutting edge, being very appropriate for the newest hardware. And again, that can come at the cost of some stability and reliability. Again, with Fedora, there's lots of proprietary software available and somewhat less of a focus on open source software. And it can be pretty complicated and take more work to install and get running the way you want. The installation process often isn't as simple as it is with other types of Linux. Examples of Fedora-based Linux distributions are Nubara, Ultramarine, and CentOS. Those are all based on Fedora. Now, the third major classification of Linux is the Debian-based Linux. And this is probably, well, not probably, it's absolutely the most widely used form of Linux. And it also tends to be the best for beginners. And that's because Debian-based distributions are largely more concerned with stability than with being on the cutting edge. So what you'll find is updates happen slower. The long-term support versions of Debian-based Linux tend to last a lot longer before they require an upgrade. They've got excellent hardware support. There's such a wide base of hardware support with Debian-based Linux, and it's got the largest community. So if you do run into challenges, you can usually find a forum or a group that'll be willing to help you out. Now, the Debian-based Linux versions, they do focus really heavily on open source software, so you're not going to get as many of those proprietary options that are made by companies that you have to pay for. And to be honest, that can be a good and bad thing. Sometimes proprietary software is better developed, but of course there's a cost there for that, right? Now, examples of Debian-based Linux are Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Zorin OS. They're all excellent distributions again. So as I say, generally speaking, Arch and Fedora are more cutting edge, more advanced, more leaning on proprietary software. Ubuntu is the more stable generally. It's generally the simpler. It's more based on open source, and it's generally considered best for beginners. So that's basically kind of how things come out in the large categories of Linux. Now keep in mind, I'm talking here in generalities. So just because I say that Ubuntu is generally considered better for beginners, it doesn't mean that there are no distributions in Arch or Fedora that a beginner can't use. Certainly there are. But generally speaking, the Ubuntu or the Debian-based versions of Linux are considered the easier for beginners to pick up. So speaking on vast generalities, that's where the three categories of Linux lie. And it's a good idea to maybe start there and say, okay, based on those three, what type of Linux does it sound like I'll be most comfortable with? Because then you can start making specific distribution selections from there. Now, once you've figured out which base type of Linux you're interested in, we start to get down into the nitty-gritty. And one of the big questions is, are you willing to learn something new and to learn something that looks different from Windows? Or what you're looking for is something that looks a whole lot like Windows, is going to act a whole lot like Windows. Because those two things are really very, very different. And I'll give you an example. So one of the most commonly recommended Debian-based Linuxes for beginners is Ubuntu. Now, Ubuntu does not look at all like Windows. It looks like Ubuntu. One commenter on a previous video, he actually said it looks a lot like Android on a phone. And I don't think he's too far off on that. But Ubuntu is considered very, very good for beginners because it's a very simple interface, it's a very intuitive interface, and most people can just look at it and sort of figure out what they need to do. So it's simple, but there is a learning curve there, and it doesn't look like Windows. So if you're the kind of person, you're like, no, I'm moving to a new operating system, I'm willing to learn something new, it doesn't have to be exactly like Windows, then that means that becomes a feature that you don't really have to take into consideration when choosing what Linux distribution you want to use. However, a lot of people say, no, I really like that Windows look. I like it to look like Windows 7. I want it to look like Windows 10 because it'll be familiar to me and it won't be such a shock when I go to use it. And I totally understand that. And there are plenty of distributions that really seek to mimic that Windows look. Distributions like Linux Mint, Zorin, KDE, Neon, they all basically strive to look like Windows, and so it does feel familiar when you go to use them. But there is a caveat with that. A lot of times people mistake looking like Windows as being the same as acting like Windows, and it's not. I myself recently have had a lot of time with Zorin OS, and Zorin was one of the ones that tons of people said, oh, it's just like Windows, it looks so much like Windows. But even though that's the case, the functionality is different. Even something very basic like your file management apps, that would be File Explorer in Windows or files in Zorin. Yeah, it looks similar, but none of the buttons work the same. Nothing's in the same place. Right-clicking has different options. So don't mistake looking like Windows with being exactly like Windows so you can just go in, you won't have to learn anything new. There's still going to be a learning curve there because things are in different places, there's different functionality, so it does take some getting used to. So when I say Windows-like, I'm just referring to the appearance that may make you feel more at home. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have a bit of a learning curve to kind of figure out how to use that new operating system. Now, to sort of figure out whether you're going to like the look and feel of a certain Linux distribution, the best thing to do is go to the website. Pretty much every type of Linux has a website that deals with and talks about what their operating system is designed to do. And you'll usually see pictures there of what the desktop looks like. Now, because you're not actually interacting with it, I wouldn't use that, put a whole lot of weight on it, but it will give you an idea of what things kind of look like inside that operating system. And if you look at those images and you're like, ooh, that looks kind of gross, you can probably write that distribution off and not even be bothered trying it out. Because it's a good indication. If it doesn't appeal to you, then it's probably not something you're going to be comfortable with anyway. Now, the next thing you might want to consider when picking out a Linux distribution is if you've got a special use case for your computer. Now, if you're just doing general computing, you're surfing the web, you're answering emails, you're using Office applications, any Linux distribution can do that. But if you've got something you're particularly interested in, like maybe 90% of what you do on your computer is gaming, you might want to pick out a distribution that focuses on that. For instance, SteamOS is specifically built for gamers. Maybe you're more into content creation. Well, you might want to look at something like Ubuntu Studio, which has been designed for content creators. So when you've got a very specific thing you do with your computer, searching out an operating or a Linux operating system that focuses on that thing, You may find that more satisfying than a more general version of Linux. Now, one thing to keep in mind with all this is Google is your friend, because you're probably saying to me, okay, Graham, well, I'm a gamer. Tell me all the Linux distributions that focuses on gaming. Well, clearly I don't have the time or the ability to do that, so Google it. You'll find that if you type in best Linux distribution for gaming, you'll come up with all kinds of results. Best Linux distribution for content creation, all kinds of results. So getting your list of Linux distributions that might work for you is really a matter of doing a lot of Googling. So decide if you want that Arch, Fedora, or Debian-based version. Decide whether or not you need it to look like Windows. Decide whether or not you've got a specific use case you really want to focus on, and then Google, Google, Google. And what you'll get is you'll get all kinds of recommendations of distributions that might work for you, and then you can go to those websites, check out what the interface looks like, see if it's appealing. As you go through this process, probably what's going to happen to you is what happened to me, which is that as I was doing that, I ended up picking 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 distributions that looked really attractive and seemed like they would meet my needs. So this is where you get to have some fun. Because once you've narrowed down that short list of distributions that might work for you, what you get to do is test, 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 and then do more testing. So the great thing about Linux is that you can run Linux off a simple thumb drive. What that means is basically you download the Linux distribution you're interested in, you convert it into a bootable USB drive using software like Rufus, and I did that previously in an earlier video, which I'll link up here. Showed you how to do that. And then you can put that thing in your computer and you can just run Linux right off the USB drive. Now, it's important to remember that when you're running it off a USB drive, it will be slower than it's actually going to be when it's installed on your computer. So if you feel like it's kind of slow and laggy, it's just because it's running off the USB drive. You won't have that when you finally go to install it. But what running it off the USB drive does is it really lets you see whether or not this distribution, this Linux distribution, is going to be good for you and whether or not you want to use it. And what I recommend is you get a decent sized USB drive, at least 32 gigabytes, maybe 64 or more, because what you want to do is you want to try downloading applications you're interested in. You want to try downloading web browsers that you're interested in. If there's specific software you know you want to use, download it and start using it. It'll all install in that USB thumb drive, and you can use it as a test case. Now, when you're done practicing with it, what happens is you just shut down your computer as normal, you pull the thumb drive out, and there's nothing left on your PC. Your PC hasn't been changed at all because everything was running on that USB drive. And so it's really a great way to sort of test out a distribution and make sure it feels good for you, and importantly, make sure it works on your hardware. Because if you've got that thumb drive installed and you can't get the video to work or you can't get the sound to work, there's a good chance after you install it, you may have a similar problem, so it would be good to know how to fix it. Now, I'm going to give you an actual example of something I ran into when I was playing around with a distribution of Linux that drove me crazy. So when I started doing my shopping for a Linux distribution to use on my work and personal PC, I thought Ubuntu Cinnamon, the cinnamon flavor of Ubuntu, was going to be ideal. It's beautiful, it worked well, I like Ubuntu. I thought, yep, this is going to be for me. But I thought, man, I better test this out fully because personally I'm looking for something for general computing, but on the work side I've got some specific needs. So when I started using Ubuntu Cinnamon, I originally had a problem with the video driver. Everything worked when I first installed it, but after 2 or 3 restarts, it wouldn't restart again. I found out it was a video driver. I downloaded new drivers from, I think it was AMD on that computer. And then I got it to boot, and that was fine, but that was still a little bit irritating. But one of the things that drove me crazy, and it was more of a smaller issue, but it just wouldn't work for me, was how Ubuntu Cinnamon dealt with online accounts. Because with Linux, you can hook up your online accounts, OneDrive, Google Drive, etc., so that it shows up in your file manager. And what you can do is you can drag a file into your Google Drive or your OneDrive account. It'll upload it to that account, and then you'll have a link there in your file manager to access it. But let's take a look at my computer here at how Ubuntu Cinnamon deals with this. And it's really weird. I've searched on all over the web. I can't find a fix for this, but this is what it does. So if you look at my screen here, I've got my Google Drive linked here to my file manager. And these are the files I have on Google. Now it's important to understand the files themselves aren't on my hard drive. What you're seeing in this folder is it's just showing me what's on the Google Drive, and these are essentially links. When I click on one, it's downloading that file from Google Drive and then showing it to me in a local application. Now on the right here, I have my documents folder where I've just made a really quick test document just for this purpose. So you know what, if I take this document and I copy it, and then I go to paste it into my Google Drive folder, what it should do is just take that file and paste it. But for some reason, Ubuntu Cinnamon, it pastes that file, so it's uploaded it to Google. Again, the file itself isn't actually in the folder. But then it also gives me this stupid link. So I get 2 copies of every file I move in there. And the problem is if I delete the link, because I don't need that extra link, it then goes ahead and deletes both. So it's not there anymore. So you either have to have 2 copies of it in your Google Drive or no copies. Now, in my job, we have people working remotely, so we share all our files by Google Drive, and I can't have 2 copies of every file sitting in my Google Drive because it's going to get confusing. So this is one of the things that drove me crazy about Ubuntu Cinnamon, is that this feature for me just doesn't work right. The other thing is I was using Ubuntu Cinnamon and I spent almost a day playing around with it. The other thing that bothered me is that every time I put in my password, I had to hit the numlock key. There was no numlock persistence. I would hit numlock when I put my password in for the first time, and then the next time I'd have to hit numlock, and the next time I'd have to pick numlock. The numlock was always turning off. Can't understand why it was doing that. There was no consistency to it, and it was driving me crazy. Again, it's a little thing. It's one of those little things that over time will get kind of irritating. Now, in case you're wondering, I decided not to go with Ubuntu Cinnamon for these reasons and a couple others. I had some hardware issues. It was just kind of glitchy and didn't really work for me, so I ended up abandoning Ubuntu Cinnamon and I decided to go with Zorin OS. And all these problems I had with Ubuntu Cinnamon, I don't have with Zorin. With Zorin, when I move a file into my Google Drive folder, just one file shows up. It does have persistence on the numlock key. I turn numlock on when I first start the computer and it seems to stay on subsequent to that. So it kind of solved those challenges. And so that's why I really point out that it's so important to really, when you're testing these distributions, test them out as you're actually going to use them. If there's software you're going to be using, load that software up and try it out. If you're going to be using cloud accounts, try moving files into the cloud account. Do things you're really going to do, because what you're going to find is some distributions are going to do things that irritate you and others won't. Some distributions are going to have workflows for some things that you're going to find awkward. Others will seem much simpler. So one of my keys is, man, if you start playing around with this stuff, you're into your first, your second, your third distribution, you haven't found anything that appeals to you, don't give up and say, well, Linux isn't for me. Because all these distributions work differently. They're all designed for different people. They'll appeal to different people. They've all got good points and they've all got points that maybe aren't for you. The fact that Ubuntu Cinnamon wasn't for me doesn't mean there aren't other people out there that just love it, because they don't maybe have to deal with the Google account issue that I ran into, because that's not something that's part of their everyday computing, right? And this is why I always say, you know, it's funny, I've done a couple of videos recently about Linux, and in the comments there's always people saying, oh, if you're coming from Windows, you have to use Linux Mint, it's the best, or Zorin is the best. There is no best Linux distribution. There isn't. They're all a little bit different. They all appeal to different people. They're all good for some, not so good for others. Find one that's comfortable for you. There's almost, you know, by some counts, there's 600 different versions of Linux out there. You're probably going to find one that you're just going to love. You just have to go through the process of sort of finding it, like choose your major distribution, whether it's going to be Fedora, Arch, or Debian. Decide whether or not it needs to look like Windows. Decides if you've got a special use case you need to address. Then find 5 or 6 and test them out thoroughly the way you're going to use them. If you do all that, I virtually guarantee you're going to find one that you like. Because there's just so much out there, and some of them are really brilliant. I've been using Zorin. I did install Zorin OS on my work and personal PC in my office. I've been using it now for a week. I just love it. Absolutely love that distribution. So keep all that in mind. There isn't one best one. What works for one may not work for you. Try them out, find something you're happy with and you love, and then run with it. Now, I hope you found that video helpful for you. I hope that gives you some ideas about how you can go and find a Linux distribution that works for you. Next week, I'm going to be showing you the easiest and safest way to move to Linux without losing your data, without blowing up your PC, even if you're not an expert at this stuff. And we'll be taking a bit of a closer look at Zorin OS, the OS I've decided to use for myself. That's coming up next week. For now, thanks for watching. Leave your comments down below. Even when I don't get a chance to respond to all of them, I love reading them, and I appreciate you guys so much for taking the time to share. Again, I'm Graham Hughes. This is Tech Talk. I look forward to seeing you on the next video.